The late, great William Friedkin's The Exorcist turned 50 in 2023, the same year as the writer and director's passing at the age of 87. A truly forceful work of fiction, The Exorcist cut a trailblazing path through the horror genre and became an instant phenomenon. A film that was feared and revered in equal measure, earning Academy Awards and box office success, along with hysterical tales of people fainting in screens, controversy surrounding its graphic content, and even bans. But The Exorcist was more than just images of ambulances rolling up to multiplexes and what Studio Warner Bros. Called the scariest movie ever made. It was a fitting tagline, perhaps, but one that belied the true heart and soul of its text, which was a deeply moving, introspective reckoning with faith, authored by William Peter Blatty, a Catholic screenwriter and novelist whose theological interiority formed the basis of his most enduring works, those being The Exorcist, The Ninth Configuration, and Legion, the latter two of which were adapted for the screen by Blatty himself and are arguably just as masterful as Friedkin's original film. In this case, we're going to be focusing on the lattermost example, a spiritual, haunting, and deeply affecting story that almost came undone. This is how the greatest horror movie sequel was almost ruined. Neither The Ninth Configuration nor Legion, which became The Exorcist 3 when it made it to the big screen in 1990, have the same kind of stature as The Exorcist, nor could they ever expect to. Friedkin's film exerts an eclipsing influence as a film foundational to our understanding of horror as a genre, a preeminence further calcified by the many paltry follow-ups and imitators that landed in its wake, most notorious of all being The Exorcist II: The Heretic, perhaps the most disastrous sequel ever made. Directed by the otherwise brilliant John Boorman, I should add, who also directed stuff like Deliverance and Point Blank. Others have come for the Heretic's crown as well. Two middling Exorcist prequels were released in the early 2000s, while the equally pallid Exorcist believer had the ignominious honor of crashing the original film's 50th celebrations last year. No one could be criticized for concluding that, with those films in mind, no Exorcist sequel would be worth their time, which is perhaps why it has taken so long for Blatty's adaptation of Legion to actually earn its flowers. Although it premiered to a muted critical and commercial reception, the reputation of Blatty's film has improved dramatically over the last 2 decades. Led in part by the cult notoriety of its iconic hallway jump scare, as well as efforts to release a director's cut, with the theatrical release of the third Exorcist film having suffered from intensive interference from studio Morgan Creek, to the point where an entire exorcism plotline was introduced and Blatty's vision compromised. A semi-salvaged director's cut of The Exorcist 3 now exists, called the Legion Cut, developed by Shout Factory for the 2016 Blu-ray release. But even in the tampered theatrical version, you can see the genius of Blatty's vision. A film that matches the lyrical prose of the Legion novel in a gorgeously stylistic manner. Demonic dread suffused with a renewed zest for earthly good. It is the one true Exorcist sequel in my mind, and probably the greatest horror follow-up ever made, albeit one that came hellishly close to destruction. To trace the roots of The Exorcist 3, you obviously have to go back to the origins of its progenitor. What would become the seminal horror film of the 1970s started as a seminal horror novel, conceived by Blatty after he read about a case of demonic possession that ostensibly occurred in the 1940s. Well, obviously the facts surrounding this case are incredibly dubious and have been scrutinized for decades, but they captivated Blatty while he studied at Georgetown University. Rather than be dispirited by such an apparently convincing account of demonic possession, Blatty took it instead as an affirmation of divinity. In other words, if there is an ultimate evil, then there must be an ultimate good. That rationale is the central conceit of The Exorcist, as well as its 1973 film adaptation, which sees Father Damien Karras, played to heart-rending perfection by Jason Miller, doubt his faith in the midst of everyday cruelty, until he is confronted by Reagan's possession and embraces God in a moment of sacrifice. It is, on paper, a sad ending, and you can totally take it that way, but for Blatty, it was meant to be inspirational, an element the author felt was obscured by the film's theatrical conclusion, which, while still the superior version in my view, led to a rift between him and Friedkin. Blatty's preferred ending, where Lieutenant Kinderman and Father Dyer start their friendship, was restored with the release of The Exorcist, the version you've never seen, in 2000, and is probably the ending that you're most familiar with by now. This rift actually persisted for years, until eventually the two reconciled. Blatty then began work on a sequel to The Exorcist that he developed with Friedkin in mind as director. However, Friedkin left the project as a result of those ever-pesky creative differences, which led to it falling to the wayside. Blatty then reshaped his Exorcist sequel into a novel called Legion, which was published in 1983 and became a hot seller. The novel itself is just as gripping as The Exorcist, maintaining those spiritual beats, albeit in a way that feels refreshingly less sure-footed. It almost seems to double back on the ending of the previous story. Evil is never simply vanquished. It persists, twists, and torments, casting doubt even when clarity has been found. If The Exorcist was steadfast in its affirmation of faith and goodness, and to be clear, one does not automatically beget the other, then Legion is more contemplative, anguished, and ultimately less sure of the answers. Both novels occupy a similar theological and reverential approach to narrative, but Legion's prose is tinged with tragedy, as the victory once earned is robbed and twisted into a cruel joke. Despite boasting no immediate connection to The Exorcist in its title, Legion became a bestseller and led to Blatty rekindling his plans for a film adaptation. Horror master John Carpenter, my boy, was even sounded out as director, but due to creative differences and suspecting Blatty wanted to direct the film himself, Carpenter ended up stepping out. Blatty was thus able to shepherd the project as he intended, as a faithful adaptation of the Legion novel, which, while inextricably tied to the events of The Exorcist and featured Lieutenant Kinderman as the main protagonist, contained no exorcism. While this state of affairs was at first deemed acceptable by production company Morgan Creek, it eventually became clear that the film Blatty wished to deliver was at odds with a studio desperate to rekindle the buzz of Friedkin's trailblazing original. A conflict that would have dramatic results on the final product. The most widely seen version of The Exorcist 3 is the same one that hit theaters in 1990. While still gripping, it was not the version Blatty initially submitted to Morgan Creek. That initial cut had no exorcism, no Jason Miller as Damien Karras, and none of Nicol Williamson's Father Morning. All three of those features, plus a change in title from Legion to The Exorcist 3, were implemented at Morgan Creek's request, leading to a film that, although retained plenty of Blatty's design, was structurally flawed. Miller's Karras feels like a seamless, if not fitting addition to the cast, given the reveal of Patient X's true identity later in the film, but Father Morning's introduction and role in the ending exorcism is bolt-on and ill-suited to the wider tone of the picture. That ending sequence is a vibrant, creative showcase of visual effects, but it is loud where the rest of the film is not. Blatty, in any case, was behooved to implement the changes prior to release, leading to reshoots and a fitting summation of the ordeal by Kinderman actor George C. Scott, who, as recounted by Mark Kermode for the release of the Shout Factory 2016 Blu-ray, apparently said that the studio, quote, wouldn't be happy unless Madonna turned up and sang a song at the end. This interference was further exacerbated by a mandated title change from Morgan Creek and 20th Century Fox, who demanded that The Exorcist be included instead of the more mysterious title of Legion. Blatty wisely sensed that this would be a misstep owing to the disastrous critical and box office return on The Exorcist 2, and that audiences would quote-unquote shun his new movie as a sequel cynically trying to cash in on a peerless classic. But he was once again overruled, with Morgan Creek providing an extra indignity by excising Legion from the title altogether. Lo and behold, when The Exorcist 3 did release in August 1990, it was not a box office sensation, grossing only moderately better than Heretic with $44 million, as opposed to its predecessor's $31 million. According to Blatty, in a scene reminiscent of J. Jonah Jameson taking pictures on Dr. Octopus's supervillain name in Sam Raimi's Spider-Man 2, the studio phoned him a few weeks after its release to attribute the film's poor performance on the title. Blatty said, quote, I couldn't believe it. They have total amnesia. And yeah, studio interference would prove to be the unmaking of The Exorcist 3, or at least its barrier to mainstream recognition. If the title switch had warded off potential viewers and diminished its reach, then it probably didn't do any favors for those who actually did take their seats in the cinema. Having The Exorcist in the title inevitably evoked the idea of a sequel trading on the success of its immortal predecessor, no matter the subtleties that were straining to be seen above all that studio intrusion. Now, I would argue that the theatrical cut is still a great time and has mostly everything that's beautiful and unique about Blatty's writing and direction. but you can certainly feel the oscillating pressures being exerted. Ultimately, despite a compelling final cut, Blatty's film was shackled by a studio that didn't know what it had cooking. When it originally released in 1990, The Exorcist III was not a critical success. Although there were early admirers out of the gate, Kermode among them, the tide of critical opinion was distinctly negative. Variety called it all mood and no meat, while Empire described the plot as a, quote, house of cards that is constantly collapsing. Despite suffering critical and box office disappointment though, the film did develop a following as time went on, being regularly championed by Kermode and finding viral fame with its iconic jump scare sequence, widely referred to as one of the scariest horror scenes ever made. This resurgent praise and interest in The Exorcist III sparked conversations over Blatty's original cut and whether or not it could be salvaged. Blatty eventually published the original script for Legion with the assistance of Kermode, which sparked further discussions of the Lost Legion cut potentially being released on home video. This, unfortunately, did not come to pass, as the original cut Blatty submitted had been lost by Morgan Creek. Yeah, despite this, efforts were still made to construct a version of the film that resembled as much of the writer and director's original vision as possible. This was achieved by Shout Factory in 2016, with the boutique label working off the blueprint of Blatty's original script, assembling a cut using a mixture of 35mm footage and VHS rushes and dailies taken from the shoot. This Legion cut, also included in the Arrow video release, is by no means a perfect thing, but it is the closest we'll ever come to seeing what Blatty's film would have looked like had Morgan Creek and Fox not intruded on its production. There's no Father Morning, no Jason Miller as Damien Karras, and no Exorcism, leaving us with a sequel that is much closer in tone and spirit to the Legion novel. A patchwork, as Kermode calls it, but one that best conveys the brilliance of Blatty's fiction. Despite the best efforts of the studio to undermine Blatty's attempts at an adaptation of Legion, The Exorcist III is still an inimitable piece of cinema, regardless of which version you're actually watching. The eccentric, more Hollywoodized aspects of the theatrical cut do create something of a tonal dissonance, but they also aren't without their charm. Although the casting came at the expense of Dourif, Jason Miller poses a powerful reminder of just how exhilarating a performer he was, embodying the possessed Karras devilishly before landing a heavy emotional blow by bringing his human form to the surface. Equally, there is plenty to admire on a technical level when it comes to the exorcism scene, which entails plenty of face-peeling hellish action, even if it belongs in a totally different movie. The Legion cut, conversely, has the disadvantage of not being a perfect recreation, with cinematographer Jerry Fisher's crisp compositions being muddied by the sadly necessary use of VHS dailies. Through it all though, Blatty's voice shines through, matching the lyrical reflective prose of the Legion novel, which is delivered expertly by the likes of George C. Scott, Ed Flanders, and Brad Dourif. In that sense, both versions of The Exorcist III are perfectly imperfect, unable to quite maintain the highs of Friedkin's lofty original, but succeeding all the same. It is a testament to Blatty that, even when his film was taken away in a different direction, its seemingly significant flaws feel minute. In the end, it's okay that we don't have a pristine version of Legion. Is it a loss? Absolutely. But focusing too heavily on what we were deprived of runs the risk of forgetting the beauty Blatty actually was able to share. In The Exorcist III, we have a film that embodies all the anguished and yet hopeful theological introspection that made Blatty's writing so enchanting. It haunts, chills, and thrills, but only so much as it loves, consoles, and mourns. Whichever version you watch, flaws or no flaws, The Exorcist III is Blatty through and through, which is to say, it's thoroughly human.